Hey everybody, Anthony Desiato here. I hope you've been enjoying the longer Halloween. What you're about to hear is a special presentation of my new Superman podcast series, Digging for Kryptonite. Digging for Kryptonite is available via its own separate podcast feed, but I'm posting the newest episode here under the My Comic Shop History channel so that all of you have a chance to sample the new show if you haven't already. The episode you're about to hear features Rich Roney, who of course you just heard in the Christmas episode of the longer Halloween. In this episode of Digging for Kryptonite, Rich and I break down Superman 2000, which was a rejected proposal by a quartet of comics creators, including Grant Morrison and Mark Waid, to take over the Superman titles at the turn of the century. It's a really interesting episode. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, please make sure that you subscribe to Digging for Kryptonite via your podcast platform of choice. It's available via all of the same services that My Comic Shop History is. So if you like it, please make sure that you subscribe. There are a number of episodes already out, including a really epic 2-episode breakdown of the Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly era of the Superman titles from the early 2000s. Which is my favorite run on the Superman books. And it was a lot of fun to be able to explore that on the new podcast. Coming up on December 16th, we have an episode with DC Comics artist V. Ken Marion. It's called Justice for Zack Snyder's Superman. I already recorded the episode. It was so much fun. Ken and I spoke for about 2 hours defending Zack Snyder's take on Superman in Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. Whether you're a fan of his take or not, I really think you'll enjoy the episode. We covered so much. So that's coming up on December 16th. And then on December 23rd, we have a special holiday bonus episode. Cosplayer Justin DeVoe and I are going to talk about the mid-90s DC miniseries, The Final Night, when the sun went out and Superman lost his powers. So that's coming up on December 16th and December 23rd. And again, we already have a few episodes that have already aired. And then there's a lot of great stuff coming up in 2021, including, as Rich and I teased, in the Christmas episode of The Longer Halloween, Rich and I are going to be talking about the 1950s George Reeves Adventures of Superman television series. So there's a lot to come. It's been an absolute blast launching the Superman show. As you all know, if you're longtime listeners of My Comic Shop History, you know Superman's my favorite character. I've talked about him a lot. I've done some book club episodes here and there. But this has been an opportunity to really explore my Superman fandom. So whether, you're a fellow diehard Superman fan, or maybe you're just kind of curious, or you just like hearing me talk, I don't know. But whatever the case may be, I really do hope that you will give the new show a chance. And really, thank you so much to everyone who already has. It really means a lot, to launch any type of new, creative endeavor and to have it be, welcomed and well received. Really, really means a lot. So thank you so much. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this special presentation of Digging for Kryptonite. For me, it began in 1992 with an ending. I was 5 years old and happened upon a comic shop advertising the death of Superman in its window display. From that moment forward, the Man of Steel has been my favorite character. And now, on this podcast, I'm exploring my fandom and examining the creative visions that have shaped the last son of Krypton across media for over 80 years. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. This week, I'm joined by one of my dearest friends, someone I've known for almost 20 years. We met and bonded at the comic shop that we were both part of for many years. So I'm very pleased to welcome to the show, Rich Roney.
Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for being part of this.
Thanks for inviting me.
This is actually somewhat of an unusual episode in the sense that we're not talking about a comic that you may have read or a television show or movie that you may have watched. Instead, we're talking about something that did not come to pass. And what I'm referring to is Superman 2000. This was a rejected proposal in the late 90s by a quartet of comics creators, Grant Morrison, Mark Waid, Tom Peyer, and Mark Millar, to revamp the Superman books at the turn of the century. And like I said, this pitch was not approved. This did not move forward. And I had heard about it, and I had maybe seen bits and pieces of it over the years, but I had never read the full thing until now, in part because I didn't know that the whole thing was available. And it was actually you, Rich, who found it and sent it to me. So I thank you for passing that along, and here we are.
Yeah. I was happy to forward it, but just to give a little bit of background to your listeners, I'm going to be joining you for another discussion at some point in the future to talk about the adventures of Superman, the TV show in the 1950s. And as I was knocking around the internet in just to find stories and background on that TV series, I discovered this proposal, and I wanted to share it with you because I know your love of the character. And I'm thrilled for this discussion. It's kind of like the road not taken. But there's elements of this thing that I genuinely like, and there's elements I dislike. But boy, it does kind of tee things up for a really comprehensive discussion.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And again, especially for discussion purposes, it's a really fascinating artifact to sort of be able to take a look at. And listeners will have already heard my discussion of the Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly Superman era earlier on this podcast. And, it's especially interesting for me because that's my favorite run of Superman comics, as listeners will have heard. But had this proposal been approved, it stands to reason we would not have gotten that other run. So again, it's really interesting for numerous reasons. But yeah, I'm really glad that you tracked it down. Now, for anyone listening to this, if you want to read it, if you just Google Superman 2000 pitch, you should be able to find it relatively easily. We're certainly not going to be reading it to you in this. And, if you have the time, I do recommend reading it for yourself. It's pretty interesting. That being said, we are going to go through it, I think, fairly thoroughly, and we'll sort of break it down and unpack all of it. So if you haven't read it, if you don't plan to read it, that's perfectly fine. It's not especially lengthy. I don't know if you read it online or if you printed it. I printed it out, and it was about 7 pages. The font was extremely small on that site, so at a normal font, maybe it'd be about a dozen pages or so. So it's enough, again, to kind of fuel our discussion, but it's certainly not, it's a pitch, it's a proposal, so it's not, overwhelmingly voluminous. Would you agree?
Definitely. For whatever reason, when I read it, I don't know why, but it was on the order of 18 pages. So I guess it somehow, like you said, it depends on the font and how the portal through which you're seeing it. But for the audience, we're not gonna read paragraphs to you, but it's definitely I'd urge your listeners to kind of peruse it and just see the big categories that they touch on, and then it'll really flesh out a lot of the stuff that Anthony and I are gonna have a dialogue on.
Absolutely. And I guess we should give a little bit of background on this proposal. Certainly we don't have any inside information about the inner workings of DC, but I do think it's helpful to sort of give some context to this proposal. And I guess what we'll talk about is, essentially what you'll find in various articles. And I know at least Mark Waid has discussed this. I found an interview on CBR from a while back where he did discuss it. So we do have some sense of what went on and why this didn't move forward. And, my basic understanding of this, and I want to get your take on it as well, Rich, is that then Superman group editor Eddie Berganza in the late 90s, he basically commissioned this proposal from this group of creators, but it was seen by, I think there was some miscommunication or some wires got crossed or what. But it was seen by the higher-ups at DC, including, I believe, Paul Levitz. It was seen as if this group was crusading for the job, like they had taken it upon themselves to submit this pitch, which sort of went or still goes against the freelancer code. And so it was not particularly well received. I think this really speaks to the internal politics at DC, and the pitch was rejected. Is that your general understanding of it as well?
Yes, and I'll add to that if I may. I think one of the things that I read knocking around the internet, I agree with everything you said. I also think there was kind of a credo or a policy at DC not to give Superman to really big creators, because the fear is they would have so much influence as a creator that they might alter the character. I think there was more of a desire to give it to up and coming writers and artists. I think that was a little part of it, just in addition to what you've.
Yes, I came across that as well, and I found that especially interesting. And I guess, I mean, on the one hand, it makes me kind of sad. I think it's unfortunate, if that is or was the policy. But to an extent, I guess I understand. But in any event, it seems like that might have been wrapped up in all of this too. So for numerous reasons, but primarily it seems the inner workings and the behind the scenes politics at DC. This didn't move forward. Yeah.
Can I add to that? One thing that really mystified me was, and we're gonna get into this a lot more, but the timing. I mean, Superman and Lois got married. I remember where I was when I bought that issue, October of 1996, and this pitch was submitted October of 1998, with an eye towards launching in 2000, early in 2000. So that was just very unusual from a timing standpoint. And everyone, you'll hear more about this as we delve into this. But the other thing that struck me is at that point in time, both Morrison and Waid were both hot. I mean, Morrison was doing JLA, and that was very popular, really well received. And Waid was just coming off Kingdom Come. So you had really two of the four were really strong individuals. Just kind of unusual from a timing standpoint.
Yes, and it's especially relevant that you mention the wedding, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But particularly, what you were saying about the creative team. Yeah, this was a powerhouse team. I mean, you spoke about Waid and Morrison, and I concur. In addition to those two, you also had the guys who were essentially their proteges at the time.
Yes.
Mark Waid and Tom Peyer worked closely, and Grant Morrison and Mark Millar. And my understanding is that relationship would sour in the years ahead, but at the time they worked very closely together. So I mean, yeah, this was a really this was a packed team for sure.
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
And so I guess what I'll do now, I know you want to share your sort of the question that I want to start with is whether we think this proposal, whether it was a missed opportunity and it would have been great if it had moved forward, or if maybe we kind of dodged a bullet and it's a good thing that it wasn't approved. And I know you want to save your final judgment for the end. I'm going to lead off with mine, and I guess let me preface it by saying I'm kind of I feel pretty conflicted, in part because this creative team and Mark Waid in particular. Waid is one of my favorite writers. Superman Birthright is one of my favorite stories, and it is hands down my favorite telling of Superman's origin. And I love so much of the other work he's done. So I'm such a huge fan, and I want to like this pitch. But ultimately, for reasons that we'll discuss, I'm actually glad that it didn't move forward. And it kind of speaks to something that, you and I have had many discussions about this, off the air over the a couple of decades that we've known each other. And I've spoken about this with other fans as well. I think as comics fans in particular, we have attachments to certain characters, and there are aspects of those characters where I think there are some fans who are maybe extremely passionate about every aspect of the character, but I think for the average fan, and I'm including myself in that, there are certain aspects of the character where I think there's room for different interpretations. And there are elements in this pitch that either I don't really have a strong opinion on, or even if I disagree with the track that they were on, it's not something that's offensive to me. But then there are places where I think, the character can sort of bend. But then there are the aspects of the character that I feel so strongly about that when something runs counter to it, again, I don't want to say it's offensive to me, but it really prevents me from enjoying it. And so there are a couple of really global, big picture views on the character that the creators here share that really run counter to how I see Superman, to the point where, as I said before, I'm ultimately glad that this didn't move forward. As much as, again, I respect these creators, I enjoy their work, I appreciate the effort they put into this. I think we would have gotten some good stories out of it for sure, but ultimately I am in the camp. I'm glad that we got the Loeb Kelly run instead. So I'll just put that out there now.
Yeah. Anthony, I was going to ask, and you're better at this than I am, but could you for the benefit of your listeners, could just try to hit all the high points of this pitch, even if you just reference it, because some of the things that what I'd like to do is share with you what I appreciated and what I kind of liked, and then also talk about what I disliked. But I'm fearful that I'm not going to give it the proper background context. You're better at that than me, because I just don't want to start leaping into granular detail and having it turn off the listeners. So if I could impose upon you spontaneously just to kind of summarize kind of what the elements of this pitch were.
You got it. And so, I mean, I want to, I really do want to go through it, together. And thankfully the pitch is structured in such a way that I think it sort of will, we can kind of borrow its structure for our conversation. I wanted to start at the end, sort of the last piece of this, because I think it's interesting in its own right. And it also leads to a larger point that I want to make sure I make, which is, at the very end of the pitch, they talk about their writing process, how they envisioned the four of them would write the 4 Superman books. So again, just as a quick refresher for anyone who doesn't remember or wasn't reading the Superman books at the time in the 90s, but you had 4 monthly Superman books: Action, Adventures, Man of Steel, and Superman. So 4 monthly books, which equated to a weekly Superman comic. And in addition to each of those titles having its own, its own numbering system, there were also these triangle numbers on the covers of all the Superman books in the 90s, denoting the reading order for that year. Because again, the books were really intertwined, and the goal really was to create a weekly Superman adventure. So at the end of the pitch, the guys here talk about what their writing process would have been for this. And they actually kind of knock the system that I just described, because as the pitch points out, what would often happen in the 90s is you would have, one creative team that was always stuck writing part 3, of whatever story was running at that particular time. So what these guys proposed was to really make it a jam session, like really collaborate on each issue. So it wasn't as if Waid was writing Superman and Morrison was writing Action and so on, but that they would all pool their efforts for each issue. And so I think that's interesting because, again, it's different than the way the books were being done at the time. But the point that I wanted to make is this is essentially the method that would be utilized during the 52 weekly series that came out after Infinite Crisis. Do you remember that, Rich?
Yes, and the comparison with collaboration between different creators simultaneously, like Waid and Rucka, just that commingling and that partnership. Yeah, 52 is a kind of an extension of where they likely would have gone had they worked on this.
Yes, exactly. And so the point that I wanted to make, the larger point, is that as we talk about the specifics of the pitch, I think there are going to be things that the listeners that will sound familiar to the listeners. And that's because when Waid and Morrison in particular had the opportunity, they incorporated a lot of these ideas when they had the chance to. I'll jump ahead real quick, but they talk about making Clark a vegan, or at least a vegetarian. And that's an idea that Waid played with in Superman Birthright. And there's a lot here that we'll get to that you see play out in Morrison's All-Star Superman. So I guess for anyone who really digs this pitch and wishes that it had moved forward, again, a lot of the ideas in it did live on, just in other ways, in other places.
Yes. Anthony, if I may, and I want you to correct me, but I kind of saw this, and I'm giving stuff away, but I think it's relevant to some of the detail. But a lot of what this was, they were going to change where things stood. They were going to effectively emulate One More Day and undo the marriage between Superman, Lois, and Clark. They were going to make changes to Superman's power level significantly. Like, one of their key ideas was, we're going to amplify his powers by a factor of 3, and we're going to amplify his intelligence by a factor of 3. So they were going to undo the marriage. They were going to change his power set, and then we're going to do other things with respect to the villains. I want to let you add anything I might have missed there, but I do want to give that because I think it's critical to some of the conclusions we're going to be speaking about.
Yes, absolutely. And so I'm glad you shared that, because I think I've buried the lead enough already. We'll come out and say it, and you already hit on a couple of the most major aspects of this pitch. But yes, the intention of this creative team was to undo the marriage between Lois and Clark in a manner extremely reminiscent of what would follow a few years later in the Spider-Man books with One More Day, and the dissolution of the marriage between Peter Parker and Mary Jane. So that was one major aspect. You also hit on this increase in Superman's power level, which, again, Morrison would really play with that idea in All-Star Superman. And then, I don't think you said this explicitly, and this was the part, more than anything else, although I have major reservations about the Clark-Lois bit, but where the pitch lost me, unfortunately, was was right at the very beginning with their view of the character. Their take on it is that Superman is the true character, is the essence, and Clark really is more of a disguise. It's a tether to his past. It's a part of him for sure, but their view is sort of that once Clark, reached puberty, reached maturation, and his powers kicked in, that, as the pitch says, he became an alien. He became sort of this other person. And so the Clark Kent identity is with him, but it's more of a way to allow him, I guess, to sort of have a break, to interact with humanity, to have that connection to his past, but that it really is ultimately a disguise. And that, for me, really runs counter to how I see the character. But I think the three largest aspects of this pitch are that view of the Clark-Superman dichotomy, the dissolution of the marriage, and the increase in power levels. Would you agree those are sort
totally.
of those are the main ideas?
Absolutely. Those are the three legs of the stool. I very much agree. And to take one of your ideas, that we're simpatico on this, I really disliked the idea that Clark is who he was and Superman is who he is now. I mean, I did follow the idea that his power level increased, during his teenage years, but they almost portrayed it as they were really embracing and fostering that he's an alien, and they got into this godlike power level and godlike view, and clearly in the movie Man of Steel they did a little bit of that, but I really did not care for any of that with respect to he's an alien, he's a god, he's so far above us that he has difficulty relating to humanity. I definitely disagreed with that, and the whole Messiah notion, that was kind of a subtle extension of it. I also disliked that.
Yeah, and it's this is where my inner conflict comes in, because again, I love these creators, and Waid in particular, and I look at what he did in Birthright, and I feel he just nailed the character. And so to read this pitch, it was disappointing, and I know you've heard this from me many times over the many years we've known each other, and listeners, fair warning, I'm probably going to say this a lot on this podcast, but it's the way I view the character. And I think that, again, as I said before, I think there are aspects where, there's room for different interpretations. And I guess with this, ultimately, I think there is too. And we've seen all different versions. I mean, you look at the Christopher Reeve, Superman movies, and they're very much, Clark was that disguise. And he was, actually they call that out in the pitch here. They call it a cartoon, that it was like a cartoonish performance when he was Clark. And I liked that in the sense that it gave us, I think, the most convincing reason for why people wouldn't be able to recognize, Clark as Superman. But this whole idea that Clark is just this facade, to me, it doesn't ring true. And so the bit that you've heard from me and that listeners will continue to hear from me is that, I don't think it's quite right to view this as binary, like it's either Clark the reporter or Superman as the true character. I've always felt, and maybe this is because I watched Smallville on television religiously for a decade, but I've always felt that Clark on the farm represents who he really is. And that when he's Clark the reporter and when he's Superman, there's an element of disguise in both. And so, again, I don't think it's necessarily binary, and I definitely don't like this idea that, again, Clark is just this disguise that, allows him to take a breather or whatever it might be. I just feel like it does a disservice to the character. It does a disservice to the Kents. I mean, obviously the values that they raised him with are still at play. I mean, I recognize that, but I don't know. I think it takes away more than it adds. I don't know. What's your view?
I totally agree with that. That it does a disservice and just really setting up the dichotomy. But If I may, one thing I wanted to say, and I want to get your feedback and your insight on this. As I digested this, I saw this whole pitch, and I'm not trying to take anything away from Tom Peyer or Mark Millar, but Morrison's love of the Silver Age, stuff Morrison did in Batman with the Black Case book. I saw so much of this as being a return to the Silver Age. For a number of reasons. Like, one of their ideas was, hey, we're going to, like we said earlier, they're going to amp up his power level. They're going to also amp up his intelligence. And a lot of the stuff they spoke about was that he would be the ultimate polymath. He would have curiosity and boundless interest in everything. And during the Silver Age, and I'm going to go on a tear for a couple of minutes, but I'm a real Silver Age fan. I grew up loving Superman in the Silver Age when he was written by Edmund Hamilton and Otto Binder, and Kurt Swan was the artist. But there were a lot of notions that just honed right in on the Silver Age, amping up his intelligence. Because in the Silver Age, he had one of his powers was super intelligence. He had total recall. He could read and speak every language on Earth. But they also spoke about, like you said, the separation between the two. And then after they do the dissolution of the marriage, they fall back on the old Silver Age and Golden Age. Lois loves Superman, but Clark just kind of sits there feeling insecure and kind of goes, why doesn't she notice me for the millionth time? I think that was one of the sentences they put in here. So really making the Fortress of Solitude a key part of their whole pitch. And boy, that was such a throwback to what I grew up with when I was reading books when I was 10 and 11 years old. The Fortress of Solitude for Superman, the Silver Age, was this real magical world. It was huge. It was a world unto itself. I mean, it was his laboratory up there. He had all his computers. He had his science rooms. He had access to Kandor and Phantom Zone. He had his robots. He had his armory. So they embraced all of that. He had his interplanetary zoo. And they even went a little bit further. I think in this pitch, they spoke about, in addition to all those things, the armory, Kandor, the map of Krypton, the interplanetary zoo, they also spoke about he would have access to this, I think they called it the infant universe of QQ, where Superman could go into different dimensions and different universes. And in one of them, he would go in and be the hero Hyperman. So they really, really, I think, went back and embraced the notions of the Silver Age. And I think that's really tied directly to Morrison. He did it with Batman and also Waid's love of the Silver Age.
Yeah, as you're talking about the Fortress and Morrison in particular, I made a note on the pitch because there's a lengthy description of what the Fortress of Solitude would be like in this revamped Superman line, and there's no doubt in my mind that Morrison wrote that. It reads like classic Morrison, and you hit on a lot of the aspects there, and that was actually one of the main things that I wanted to ask you in particular. We always have great conversations about comics, and recently, Superman in particular, we've been having, wonderful chats, and I've enjoyed them tremendously. And one of the reasons why I love talking to you in particular is that, you've been reading comics since the 60s, right? So you've seen all of these different iterations, you've seen the evolution, and, there's this idea that they start with at the very beginning of this pitch, right off the bat, this notion that every 15 years, there's a need to sort of refresh these characters, and they sort of cite the numerous examples of this. And at the time, most recently, it was the Byrne revamp in the late '80s, following Crisis on Infinite Earths. And as the turn of the century was approaching, we were getting to the point of another one of those 15-year cycles. I guess the question I have for you is, because I agree. I mean, it seems like this would have brought back a lot of those pre-crisis elements, and it again seemed to be a pivot away from the Byrne era of the character, where his power levels were much more modest. There was much more of an emphasis on Clark. Clark was who he was. Superman was what he could do. Obviously, Clark and Lois were in a relationship for the majority of the 90s. They got married. So a lot of what's at play here really seems to be pivoting away from Byrne and back more into pre-crisis ideas. And I guess the thing that I'm especially curious about to hear from you is, as someone who grew up reading those stories, I mean, do you look at this pitch and think, wow, this is great, like they're bringing back all the stuff that I grew up reading? Or do you look at it and say, I think this is a step backwards?
Somewhere in the middle. Give me a second. What the good and the bad, like when I was 10 and 11 years old, there were a number of stories where the backdrop would be the fortress. Superman might take Jimmy Olsen there, or there. I do remember one really good story where Superman and Supergirl were both up in the fortress, and one of Superman's trophies from another world. Something happened in the environment of Earth, and it released a certain gas, and it made Superman and Supergirl enemies. So they had a fight in the fortress, and they each went into their the armory and got certain Kandorian or Kryptonian weapons. So the fortress was a real backdrop for stories, but there was other elements, Anthony, I'll tell you. I really liked Byrne's run because it made Superman much more grounded. Clark was not the milquetoast. He was a very accomplished journalist in his own right. So the elements of the Silver Age got to the point where it got silly, like red kryptonite would give Superman the head of an ant, or Jimmy Olsen would be a giant turtle boy. It really went kind of far too creative without boundaries, and it just became silly. So Byrne's relaunch, I thought, made him much more grounded, and I'm impressed with Byrne's relaunch. Like you say, to me, the quintessential origin story is Birthright, but boy, I think Byrne did a great job kind of dusting things off and going back to basics.
Yeah, and I appreciate, I love always getting your insight on that. And you use the word grounded a couple of times, and that's what's especially interesting to me, or one of the things that's especially interesting about this pitch is that, one of the criticisms, right, that you always hear about Superman is that he's not relatable, and or it's hard to come up with credible threats for him. And I've never agreed with that. And I think one of the things that I sort of realized, I started with the death of Superman. And so when your first exposure to a character is that character's death, the whole notion of, oh, well, he's too powerful, he can't be defeated, like really doesn't carry any weight because I've seen that, no, there is a limit to his power. But those are some of the common criticisms. And it just seems to me that amping up his power level and sort of putting Clark in the back seat, I don't know how that would combat those criticisms. I feel like it would only make it harder in certain respects to make the character relatable, at least from my perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I do. And I please, you're the pilot and I'm kind of the passenger, but I will share with you, there are a number of things I did like about this pitch.
I don't want to cut you off, but we just have to take a real quick commercial break, and then let's get right into what you liked and what you didn't like. We'll get more specific. So just hold that thought, and we'll be right back to the action in a moment, right after this word about our sponsors. Submissions are now open for the March season of the Brightside Tavern Film Festival in Jersey City, New Jersey. Visit filmfreeway.com to submit your film now. Also, be sure to listen to the podcasts hosted by the festival's organizer, CJ Cullen. You can find the official Hang On to Your Shorts podcast, as well as the Cullen on Film podcast, via a shared universe network. The Hive Comics and Games is an oasis of nerd fun and events in the heart of Odessa, Texas. Whether it's comic book superhero stories or role-playing in a dungeon, the Hive is where to be. Come tap your mana and face off against the top Magic the Gathering players in West Texas. Hive carries a majority of new comic titles each Wednesday and has all of your favorite titles in their back issue section. Follow them on Facebook at The Hive Comics and on Instagram at The Hive Comic Shop. And we're back. All right, so yeah, let's get into more specifically about what you liked and didn't like. And let me just say, just as one more disclaimer, I as I'm sharing my view on the pitch and the specifics of it, I recognize that, I grew up reading the Byrne Superman. Again, I started with Death of Superman. I read all through the 90s and beyond. And I watched Lois and Clark, which was, very much born out of that view of the character. And so, that was so ingrained in me that I do recognize that maybe part of the reason why this ruffled my feathers a little bit, is that it ran so counter to the Superman I knew. And I do recognize, although I know you're kind of, somewhere in the middle here, but I do recognize that for people who, grew up with a different version of Superman, this might have felt like a return to form. So I fully recognize that. I just want to put that out there. But yeah, please tell me, Rich. And I think I know one of the things that you're gonna say is one of your likes, but I'll leave that to you.
Okay. There were many things I liked about this. And just let me kind of collect my thoughts. I did like it, and like you said, it's depending upon how it's printed, it might be either 7 pages or 12 pages. But I did like the idea to increase his intelligence, but more so to increase his curiosity. Because in a lot of the young Silver Age stories I read, he was very, very much Jor-El's son, Jor-El being a scientist, and he had an aptitude for science. I liked, though, that one of the things that there was a paragraph on, they spoke about how they were really going to portray him and his interest in humanity, his great compassion, and how Clark was really a sounding board for everyone, either at work or in Metropolis, who had problems. He was a superb listener. So I really liked the focus on his curiosity and his compassion. For the listeners, there were a couple of other ideas in this pitch that I found interesting that, again, they're gonna dissolve the marriage. And Anthony and I, we both used the words, hey, this is akin to One More Day, which came a few years later with Spider-Man. But the notion here, I found the basis of doing this very interesting. They were really positioning it that, memories are not electrical in your mind. They're really a chemical reaction. So Brainiac came up with this way to make Lois's memories of her husband, Superman, or Clark, make those memories poison her. So incrementally, she was dying. She was being killed. She was being poisoned by virtue of her love for Clark. So I thought that was a really powerful notion. And then the way they worked around it, they did build up to it. And I think one of their ideas was they really want to build up their love and then have it come crashing down. But they were going to use Mixlix-Pillix to magically save Lois. But, when he's in our dimension, he's mischievous. He's like Loki. So he couldn't do it easily. He had to do it in a way that would hurt Clark. But I thought that whole idea about the chemical poisoning and then the again, it came 7 or 8 years later, the One More Day thing. I did like, just a couple of more things. I liked maybe 3 other things. I really liked how they were going to try to inject a little bit of randomness in his rocket being from Krypton back to Earth. They were going to kind of make it a little bit more random and not as perfectly known that he would land on Earth. And I kind of thought that was pretty good. It would speak more to the desperation of Jor-El and Lara to save their child, but they wouldn't have certitude of where he was going to land or how he might do things. I would even be fine going, yep, the rocket can go to Earth, but we really don't know the outcome, So I'd want a degree of confidence in his parents that their child, their infant, will be safe, but I don't want it so foreordained or foreknown that it's sterile. So I did like a little bit of the randomness, like the computer that searches out for the perfect planet kind of bombs out, and only the safety mechanisms of the rocket get him to Earth. I liked that. I liked they did have the notion in there that he was going to be trained by the JSA. I think they said maybe the Atom, maybe others. I think that would be fascinating, because if his powers manifested themselves when he was a teenager, if he could interact with the JSA, it's not just the atom. I mean, you could have like Jay Garrick give him techniques on how to use super speed, and you could also play up the difference in their powers. Like Jay can vibrate his molecules to phase through things. Superman can't. And you could have like Hawkman or Starman or Green Lantern help him learn how to fly. So I think the potential to use the JSA as teachers was interesting. And then the other stuff I liked was how they portrayed the villains. Just real fast, Luthor's, even in a realm of geniuses, he's a super genius. They were really going to play up his intellect. He could play 20 chess grandmasters at once, and he could read Urdu through a Walkman he developed himself. So his phenomenal, off the scales, off the charts genius level was interesting, but they also tapped back into his ego, the same way John Byrne did, that he set himself up to be the greatest person on Earth, and then he was devastated because Superman kind of stole his limelight. And then the very last thing I liked was how they portrayed Brainiac, that he is just no compassion, no humanity whatsoever, and that Clark and Superman is really scared of him. He's the one villain that he really fears. So I'm going to pause there. I know I threw a lot at you.
No, I enjoyed very much, getting your take on all of that. And I was trying to keep my thoughts in order, about how I would respond to the points that you raised. And for the most part, I agree with almost everything you said. And you hit on a lot of the things that I did also like about the pitch. And, just to be clear, even though, again, I'm glad that we ended up with the Loeb Kelly run instead, there is some cool and interesting stuff in here. And I guess maybe sort of working my way backwards or jumping around a bit. I agree with you. I think the take on the villains was interesting. And they specifically cite this idea of, each villain sort of representing an aspect of Superman's personality or background or what have you, taken to the extreme or taken in a wrong direction. And, Brainiac, of course, is an obvious example of, the alien side of him, no humanity, no compassion. And there were numerous other examples, and they talked about Bizarro and Mxyzptlk and Toyman and Prankster. And I think the take on the villains was actually pretty cool. I did dig that. We need to spend more time on the Lois and Clark of it all, but I do agree with you that if they were going to dissolve the marriage, the way they came up with it, and you laid it out beautifully, I don't really need to add much to that, other than to say that sort of the lead up to what you described about how it would actually be undone was that Luthor and Brainiac discover Clark's secret, expose it to the world. They kind of run him through this gauntlet of his villains, so he's like really off his game. And then comes this move that you described of Brainiac turning Lois's chemical memory of Clark's identity to poison, and so he has to turn to Mxyzptlk. Again, I don't like. Well, we'll spend more time on that, but I will say I think it does sort of quote unquote fix one of the major problems with Spider-Man One More Day, which was. And we could do a whole podcast on that. But for anyone not familiar, in that case, Spider-Man made a deal with Mephisto because his elderly aunt lay dying. And I think in that case, not to be cold towards Aunt May, but, this was a frail elderly woman who had lived a very long life. And, here you have Peter giving up his life with, the woman he loves, the woman he's married to save his aunt. And I think that aspect of it, among other parts of that story, were kind of tough for fans to stomach. Here, it was a case where Lois herself was literally in dire jeopardy. It was, a very difficult situation. So I think they did a little bit of a better job there. And so, yes, I think the how of it was clever. And I'll give them that. I too really like the JSA angle. I thought that was really cool. That's what I knew you were going to bring up because I know how much you love the Justice Society of America, and I think it's cool. I think some of the examples that you gave would have been great to see, and I think it's an awesome way to sort of weave Clark into this larger DC universe mythology. So I think that's really cool. I really like that a lot. Where you and I differ a little bit is on the Jor-El bit, where, as you said in this pitch, Jor-El and Lara don't know They're not purposely sending Clark to Earth. And, I'm a relatively new father, and so maybe this is fueled a little bit by that. But I think, there's enough uncertainty sending baby Kal-El out through the stars toward Earth. You don't know if he'll make it to Earth. You don't know what's waiting for him on Earth. I think it's risky enough. I don't know that we need to add this additional layer of they don't even know what planet he's going to. I think that's a bridge too far. Now, that being said, no, go ahead.
No, please. I totally agree with what you said. I mean, I do want his parents to have comfort and confidence. Yeah, I do. I didn't want to portray it. From the way I read their pitch, it almost is like there was too much certitude. But as you articulate it, look, he's escaping this exploding planet. We know he's going to go to Earth, but there's unknowns. It's a more primitive culture and stuff like that. Or, he's an infant. Who's going to take care of him? So I'm walking back some of the things I said. I just didn't want it to be so perfect that. Because, there's been other stories like where Thomas Wayne goes to Krypton and, talks to Jor-El and stuff like that. I do think some of the things have gone a little too far. So I want the parents to, if I may, pass on knowing that their child is reasonably safe. And that's probably the better way to say it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're on the same page. And, to your point about some iterations going too far, what I was actually going to say was there's this episode of Smallville in season 3 where we find out that Jor-El actually spent time on Earth years ago and met the parents or grandparents of Jonathan Kent. And so the whole idea was that, not only was Earth a specific destination, but that the Kents were actually chosen by Jor-El. That, I think, is a step too far. Now, on
Agreed.
Smallville, they needed to find, they had 10 seasons, so they had to keep finding like these new layers that they could peel back. But I think that's a step too far. But I like the idea of Jor-El at least knowing about Earth. I think there's enough risk, enough uncertainty. You almost get to the point where if they're just shooting him into space, hoping for the best, and
that's too extreme.
It's almost too extreme. I mean, we could have a whole philosophical debate about this, but like as a parent, I don't know. Obviously, you don't want your son to die with you on this exploding planet, but at the same time, you could be sending him off to a fate worse than death. So, so that's where they lost me a little bit there. But I get the reasoning behind it that you articulated. We're talking about Jor-El. Can we shift and talk about Clark's earthly father for a moment? Because that's another aspect of this where they advocate for the death of Pa Kent. What did you think about that?
I'm so ambivalent on that. I mean, one of the I think phrases that this quartet used was, we Clark's on top of the world. I mean, they did want to separate Clark and Superman, and both of us are opposed to that, and your audience will hear it in a different discussion. I'm very much a big fan of Clark, but I can see their point. Like everything was going his way. Like, even in Burn Run, he had certain weightlifting equipment in his apartment to, kind of explain his physique. And he had so many things going for him. I'm hurt because I have a tremendous affinity. I think Byrne's reintroduction of his parents, plural, was just so good. And it helped him even when he was a young Superman, say a Superman who was 27 or 28. So I can see how killing Pa Kent would inject tragedy and hurt and pain, but I'm not a fan of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And again, I recognize, as I said before, this is probably in large part due to the fact that, I grew up reading the Byrne version of Superman where his parents are there and they're that sounding board for him. And, I get what the creators here are saying that, you don't want to use that so much as a crutch where, Clark can just always get advice from as they describe, the infinitely wise, Jonathan Kent. But, one of the things that I've always loved about Superman is that, at least in the versions that I've read, he's not driven by tragedy. He has the death of his planet, right? That's part of his history, but it's not a planet that he knew. But at the same time, I think there's an element of, he doesn't want to lose another world. And I think that's enough. I mean, we have, superhero after superhero driven by the death of a father figure or a mother as well, or both parents, in the case of Batman. So, it just feels unnecessary. And I think that's one of the things that makes him relatable, that humanizes him, and that sets him apart from the other characters. That being said, I'll argue against myself here a little bit. As I said earlier that, there are aspects of the character where I can bend a little bit. And Pa Kent and whether he lives or dies, this is actually something I don't want to say I'm on the fence, because I really ultimately am in the camp of I want him alive, but I always go back to Superman the movie with Christopher Reeve, and that scene of young Clark at the gravesite of Jonathan. He's standing there with Martha, and I get choked up every time I see that scene where he says, all these powers, like everything I can do, and I couldn't save him. And so to me, it's like if Jonathan's death serves the role of, teaching Clark this lesson that for as powerful as he is, he can't save everyone, but he's going to try anyway. And it sort of marks the end of, his adolescence and his passing into adulthood. I get it, and I'm okay with it. But ultimately, I don't think it's really necessary. But again, I sort of do go back and forth on that one.
I hear you. And what's so interesting is Byrne runs contrary to all the previous origins. I mean, you spoke about the Christopher Reeve Donner movie with Glenn Ford. Later on in time, we're going to talk about the Adventures of Superman from like 1953. And once again, Pa Kent, even, it wasn't Jonathan at that time, he dies very abruptly. Same as Glenn Ford movie. And then even in a number of the Golden Age stories, Pa Kent dies. In the Silver Age, both parents died very close to one another. You articulated it very eloquently. I'm not absolute. I can kind of see shades of gray, but I really land on the side. I feel better in the stories when Clark can turn to his parents for advice or just perspective or being a sounding board. So, I don't feel absolutely one way or the other. It's not binary in my mind, but I lean towards more. I'm much, much, much happier with the parents being alive, both parents.
Yeah, and I mean, look, not to make light of it, but it's one of those things where, it's like if you go to watch a new Batman TV series or movie, it's like, well, whether it's the first scene or a little bit later, you're going to watch those parents get gunned down in Crime Alley. And it's become a similar thing with Superman. It's like whether it's the TV shows or the movie, it's like sooner or later, Pa Kent's grabbing that arm and he's going down.
Yeah.
And so again, you're right. I mean, in more tellings than not, Pa Kent dies. And I mean, currently as we're speaking, I know the Kents are back in the comics, but even in the the post-crisis, the Byrne era, if you will, when Jeff Johns was writing Action Comics, they killed off Jonathan Kent. And that obviously took place much later in Clark's journey, which I especially disliked because again, I'm open to it if it plays out earlier, along his journey. I just don't think it adds as much once he's already a fully grown adult and he's Clark and he's Superman. I don't know. If it's going to happen, I think I kind of like it to mark the end of his time in Smallville. But I think we've thoroughly covered what's really just a few paragraphs in this pitch here. As far as other things though, that I don't really have a strong opinion on, and maybe people would be surprised by this. They mentioned doing away with the red underwear. I'm fine with that. I really, I'm not one of those fans who, really thinks he has to have the red underwear on the outside of his costume. It's fine. I mean, obviously it's an iconic costume and that's how he's known the world over. But, there have been instances, of course, in the comics and in the movies where he doesn't have it. And I think the costume still looks cool. I think as long as there's a belt of some sort to break up the blue, I think it works. So that part didn't offend me. Do you have an opinion, Rich, on the on the red underpants, the red trunks?
I did see some of the images where they were no longer the full red trunks, but more of a red belt. And I kind of liked that. I thought that was much more of a modernization. So I kind of lean on the side that I was okay with the removal of the red trunks.
Yeah, no, fair enough. They do talk a bit about the Daily Planet and the other supporting cast, and I want to, so I have to tip my hat to them here, because one of the things that they specify in this pitch is that they really wanted to bring the focus back to Superman and not make it such a sprawling soap opera cast. And for people who remember the Superman books at the time, the supporting cast had grown quite large, and it's been a while since I've revisited a lot of those mid to late 90s stories. So, my memory of it is somewhat vague, but there were a lot of other characters floating around, and it's probably fair to say that, Superman had taken at least a little bit of a back seat. So this whole idea of really drilling down on Superman and really making him the center of it, I do think was a smart move. And, they talk about the Daily Planet and some of the supporting cast. One of the things that they planned to do with Lois was make Lois a foreign correspondent. What was interesting is that in the Loeb Kelly run, they actually made Clark a foreign correspondent at the beginning of their run. That actually made a tremendous amount of sense because that accounted for why Clark would disappear for long stretches. So that actually made a lot of sense. In this pitch, it would have been Lois who was working overseas. And I liked their take on Jimmy Olsen. And I think you see that play out in the Loeb Kelly run as well, where, there's this mutual respect between Clark and Jimmy, or Jim, as Clark calls him. He treats him as an adult in a way that the other people around them really don't.
Agree. Totally agree. I did like that. And I didn't know that. I think they referenced the radio show that Clark is the only one who calls him Jim. And that respect that, hey, Jim, you're an adult. I really liked that. And I thought the definitions for the supporting cast were very good. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
You tell me. You're the pilot and I'm the passenger.
Well, I mean, I guess the last major thing that we've already talked about the how of the dissolution of the Lois and Clark marriage and her losing her memory of Clark's identity. We've talked about how they would have gone about that, and it seemed like we were in agreement that it was a somewhat clever way to do it. I think people listening to this, will probably say, oh, that was One More Day. But keep in mind, this was written years before One More Day. Yeah,
this was almost 9 years earlier.
Exactly. But let's talk about the fact of it. This was, again, the two things where they completely lost me were, again, the emphasis on, Superman is who he really is, not Clark, and doing away with the relationship between these two, which to me, has always been one of the, most important and relatable, aspects of the character, at least in the versions that I grew up reading and watching. So, I mean, how did you feel about the fact that the marriage was going to be undone?
Very disappointed. And I'm going to take cue from you. For me, while I voiced things that I found appealing and interesting and I liked, for me, the dislikes of this pitch outweighed the likes. And just to tee it up, and then you expand where you'd like me to go, there were really 4 things I disliked. Undoing the marriage was clearly one of them, and I'll delve more into that in a minute. But just to give you an idea of the other things, so you can pinpoint the discussion of the 4 things. Undoing the marriage was one. Making him more powerful by a factor of 3, I think, is a mistake, because who in God's name is he going to fight? Who's going to present a challenge to him? So I think amplifying his powers is a mistake. Separating him from Clark, I think, and going into that space where he's an alien and he's not one of us. And the only thing tethering him to Earth is the values instilled by the Kents, the humanitarian stuff. I think that's separation from Clark. was wrong, and embracing that he's an alien, he's a god, he's a messiah. I didn't care for that. So those were the pronounced things I did not like. But in response to your question, I think undoing the marriage and everything we've seen, I'm a huge fan of Tomasi's run, where they have Lois and Clark, and for a few issues they had a young, like 6 or 7 year old son. I thought those were fantastic. But even the other stories where Lois is a partner and she can coach him or give insight or be a sounding board, exchange ideas. I think they really, really moved the marriage forward and made the stories more appealing to older readers. So I'm a big fan of preserving the marriage, and I think it added to the story.
I could not agree more. And, it's the sort of thing, I can even put the marriage aside, but the whole idea of, them erasing her knowledge of his identity and reinstating the Clark, Lois, Superman love triangle. And that really rubbed me the wrong way. And that was actually one of the things that I really wanted to ask you, because, again, when I started reading with the death of Superman, she already knew his secret. They were engaged at that point when I started reading. So that was the version that I grew up with. That's the way it always was. And, again, I watched Lois and Clark in the mid 90s, the television series, and the first couple of seasons, she doesn't know. And they play around with that triangle. But then by the start of season 3, she's in on it, and it gives it a completely new dynamic. And, again, I don't mean to always go back to Smallville, but Smallville's my favorite. And, watching that show for as long as I did, the Clark's, even though he wasn't yet Superman and there wasn't a secret identity per se, he did have this secret about his origins and his powers. And, over the course of 10 seasons, almost every, cast, almost every character in the cast would sooner or later come to learn his secret. And even though they were able to mine a lot of drama and angst from the tension when the character didn't know the secret, whichever character we're talking about, whenever that character was let in on it or discovered the secret, it made the show better. It just opened up all of these new avenues and new dynamics. And again, I just always felt like you gained so much more than you ever lost. And so, this whole idea of like really taking a major step back with Lois and Clark was just so disappointing to me. And the thing I wanted to ask is, because you grew up reading stories with the love triangle where she couldn't tell them apart, and she was always trying to figure out Superman's secret identity, and she loved Superman but not Clark. I mean, how gripping was that? I mean, was that interesting and entertaining enough that it would be worth going back to?
Oh, well, I truly think it's your own age as a reader. I mean, to be as honest as possible, when you're 9 or 10 or 11 years old, and like you're not the captain of the football team, you're not the popular kid. It's almost appealing to have that, to say I identify with Clark. If only those pretty girls could see me when I take my glasses off, so to speak. So it's appealing to a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old who's not one of the popular squad. But as I grew up, as I aged, I want stories that are written on a different level. So I think it would have, I do think it depends on the age of the reader and their emotional background and where they are in their life. But I think on balance, the stories are now where Lois is, I think it's a superb role model. She's his partner. They're partners in they love one another. They're partners in life, and they face problems together. I think that's an infinitely better portrayal. And even like I said, I love Tomasi's run where they're parents and they have like a 6-year-old son, and how they're trying to deal with him and coach and instruct him. So I land on the side of it. The marriage or her knowledge of his identity, I think, is significantly, it adds to the story and makes it a better story.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that it does her character a disservice if she can't tell them apart for that extended a period of time. I mean, like in the movies, it's one thing because it's a 2-hour runtime, it's one thing, but with a television series or, an ongoing comic series, 4 titles a month, and not to have too geeky a conversation about this, but, the whole question of how effective the disguise actually is. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say this. I should have said that earlier. In the Silver Age, again, I mean, he had more powers than you can count. And we spoke about this. One of the tenets of this pitch was they're going to amp up his power level. Well, one of his powers, in addition to super intelligence, total recall. I mean, the Superman I grew up with remembered Krypton. He knew he had total recall, and they would attribute to like certain exposure to green kryptonite would obviate some of his memories. But he also had, one of his powers was super hypnosis. So there was a theory that people would, when they saw Clark, would see someone who had more of a receding hairline, who bent over more, who looked older than Superman, and that was one of his powers in the Silver Age. So it made it a little bit plausible that Lois, circa 1962 or 1969, would not see the two of them as being, hey, Clark is just Superman with glasses and a blue suit.
Gotcha. And, fair enough that they, at least, attempted to account for that in story. They don't lay that out explicitly here that they were going to, incorporate some of those other abilities that you mentioned, but, they do spend a lot of time talking about Clark's enhanced power. So maybe they would have worked something like that in to better account for how she can't tell them apart. Which is fine. And I guess that would address, the concern that I just raised. But, overall, it's like as we kind of wind down here and sum up, I feel like what we're left with is, a character more aligned with his alien origins than his earthly ones, who doesn't have the Kents there as a sounding board, who doesn't have his wife there as a partner, who's more powerful and more removed. It just, I don't know. It takes the character too far away from the essence that I really respond to. And so, are you comfortable at this point now? We've been talking for just over an hour. Will you give us your final judgment? Are you glad that this didn't move forward? Do you think it, or do you think it was a missed opportunity?
No, I'm relieved it did not move forward. I love Waid, and we've had many discussions about that. I even gave you a letter to carry to him when you were in California. But I think this being the road not taken, I'm glad they didn't take this road. Again, I think probably the 3 biggest things, I think moving him more into the realm of being an alien is a mistake. I think dissolving the marriage and her knowledge, while it was innovative how they might have gone about it, I think it would have been a mistake. And I also think probably the thing that really struck me the most was amping up his power. I think would have been so constraining to a writer, because who's going to challenge him? Who's he going to fight? I mean, the guy was basically, Doomsday and was it Mongol and Darkseid are like the only 3 guys that could really give him a play for his powers. Who's he possibly going to go up against in the future?
100%. And, it's funny because I know you and I are both conflicted about this because we do both love Mark Waid. and yeah, you mentioned when I met him, so I interviewed him for my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country. I mean, he came to my hotel room and we filmed an interview, and I told him how much I love Superman Birthright. So it's like, I love this guy and I love his work, and I generally love his take on Superman. Again, though, what's presented in this pitch, and maybe it's an influence of, the other writers. It wasn't just him, but maybe this was the way he saw the character at the time. I mean, I'm not sure.
And Anthony, to your point, sorry to interrupt. I really apologize. You and I have discussed this many times in the past. How shall I say it? Where do these creators' own intrinsic ideas stop? I mean, what sort of direction did they get from Eddie Berganza when they were given this assignment? I mean, might he have said certain things that, okay, well, we're going to go in this direction, so here's how I would make it work. I don't know how much of it is the creators' ideas unto themselves versus an instruction or just a path that the editors or management wanted them to take.
Well, yes, that is an excellent point and a good question. And, unfortunately something, we don't know, and I don't know that we'll ever get, an answer on that. But I guess let me ask a harder question now. And this is one that I don't even know how to answer because, we both gave our, our take on whether, we wish this had happened or we're glad that it didn't. But and again, I do think we've really come at this, we've shared our personal views, but we've also taken a more analytical look at it. But, ultimately it's, what would we have wanted to see or not see? But do you think that, again, this is, I think, the harder question. It's like, do you think that this would have helped the character, helped the sales, helped the overall line of books? And again, this is a major, because we have no idea, but it's like, do you think that this ultimately would have been a positive for the character and the character's place in the industry?
I don't. And I say that real quickly. I mean, I think about what they did in 2011 when they relaunched. And then candidly, 5 years later, they undid it. I think they would have gotten a bounce out of this in 2000. I think clearly you got, again, Morrison and Waid were hot. But I don't think it would have lasted. So I think sales would have increased on a temporal level, but I don't know if it would have been sustainable. I think I would wonder where would they go 2.5 or 3 years down the road after you've exhausted some of these villains and the Parasite and Toyman, and you've exhausted all the magic of the Fortress of Solitude and Superman going into that infant universe to be Hyperman. Where are you going to go next? So I think it's better for the character and the stories. I'll say, listen, I've never read the Loeb Kelly run. I did read Action 775, What's Wrong with Truth, Justice, and the American Way, but I haven't read any of those things. So I kind of made a note to myself to read more of the Kelly and Loeb run, just for my own self-knowledge. But I did love the Byrne run. Again, I thought it made Superman more interesting when they stripped all the extremes of the Silver Age away, and they got him more grounded. So I think it would have been a mistake if they had gone with this.
You brought up a couple of fantastic points because I guess the question that I posed to you was something that, again, I was trying to play devil's advocate with myself, and I asked myself that question. But your points are very well taken because, yes, we saw in the New 52, an instance where both the Kents were dead and Lois and Clark were not together and she didn't know his secret. And, again, as you said, the 52 as a whole, while it gave, a sales bump at the time, ultimately they undid it. And, we keep comparing the undoing of the Lois and Clark relationship to One More Day. You look at the backlash to that. So, yeah, it's like, I don't know ultimately how this would have been received. One other thing that I just wanted to mention quickly is, since we've been comparing this to One More Day, I had major misgivings about that, and I still think it was a mistake for various reasons. And maybe one day I'll do a whole podcast on Spider-Man and I'll talk about it. But I can understand it a smidge more because I do recognize that for a large period in the Spider-Man history, his love life, got a lot of play, and there were numerous romantic interests, and they really played up that, that soap opera angle. With Superman, I mean, I know there have been other love interests, but and again, I've read very little of the pre-crisis Superman. That will change over the course of this podcast, but I really haven't. But to me, it's just, it doesn't seem like that soap opera angle, was as prevalent. And so again, it just seems like, that's just one less reason to try to bring it back. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
But your points are very well taken. And, I'll say this to anyone listening to this who, disagrees with us, that's perfectly fine. And if you're like, oh man, like that really would have been great. If you love this whole idea of, an enhanced Superman, read All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison. And if you love the idea of, Lois and Clark not being together and there being that triangle and all of that, read the New 52 Superman. Or again, certainly there are, tons of pre-crisis stories for you to choose from as well. But, we've seen a lot of the stuff that's discussed here. We have seen, in various iterations. So it is there if you want it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you wanted to say, Rich? Anything because I know you had your list that you wanted to, is there anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to share before we sign off?
No, I covered you were very gracious and patient. I covered all the things that occurred to me. So yeah, I thank you for this opportunity. And if I may, I'd urge your to your audience, to your listeners, you could probably read this whole thing in 1/3 the time that Anthony and I have discussed it. So, like Anthony said, Google Waid Superman proposal or Superman 2000. It's an interesting read. I mean, and I guess the one thing I would say is, Anthony, I'm always ambivalent about this. I feel sorry when writers or artists are instructed to take a character in a different direction, and sometimes you got to do it to re-energize the character. Other times, you know what? Less is more, leave it alone. So I'm always ambivalent. I don't want to denigrate a creator because now and then they have to do something to jumpstart sales or reawaken and reignite interest in the character. But the idea might be one thing and the execution might be something else.
That is a very, very fair point and well said. And, kind of on that note, I'm glad you brought that up because it really is worth mentioning. And over the course of this podcast, I am going to revisit the 90s because, again, I was a kid reading it for the first time, and I really haven't gone back to it since. And this is not, to put down the work of the creators at the time, but, by the time the 90s were winding down, Superman, the character, and, publishing-wise, the line of books, they needed a shot in the arm. And, we'll do other episodes in the future where we kind of, dissect that a little bit more. But I think the long and short of it is that a number of the creators had been working on the books for years at that point. And, I think there's a level of burnout that's natural, for any creative person, especially if you're, working with one character for that period of time. And the other aspect is, they had this huge, massive success with the death of Superman, in 92, 93. And I think for most of the rest of the 90s, they were sort of always trying to replicate that in some way. And, you saw all sorts of things like the Electric Superman, Superman Red, Superman Blue. There was all kind of stuff. And, I think the law of diminishing returns was really at play there. And so by the time you got to the turn of the century, you did need a shot in the arm. And so to your point, Rich, I think, I think these were noble efforts undertaken by people who really, care about the character and have a love for the character. Ultimately, as I keep saying, I'm glad we ended up with the Loeb Kelly run because I think it did address a lot of what wasn't working in the books at the time. I mean, they really did focus back on the core cast of characters. They brought an element of humanity to the books that I've always responded to. The Clark and Lois dynamic was definitely a highlight. So I think they did what the books needed at the time. And obviously with this pitch that we've been discussing, it was a different direction and it might have been interesting. Again, ultimately I'm glad it didn't move forward. I'm still really glad that we got the stories that we did get from these creators like Birthright and like All-Star Superman. But again, just kind of bringing this full circle, this was, really an interesting artifact, to find, to read, to discuss. And, Rich, I can't thank you enough. We always have great chats and I appreciate you, taking the time. And I know you always come with your notes and you let me know what you want to go through. And I love that. And, we wouldn't be having this discussion if you didn't shoot me an email saying, hey, I found this Superman pitch. So I thank you.
No, I was happy. And, I was happy to find it myself. And even when I read the first page of it, I said, geez, I got to get this to Anthony. I got to get it to him. And to your listeners, just not to give anything away, but Anthony and I have probably spent the last, what would you say, Anthony, 5 weeks, 6 weeks?
Yeah, at least.
And Superman, I loved him when I was a child in the 1960s. Loved him. I loved Kurt Swan's work, but I lost interest as I was in high school, I lost interest in him. So, Anthony, your passion and your excitement and the discovery of stuff on your part has really energized me to learn other things. And that's why as soon as I saw this proposal, I had to share it with you. And I'm just glad we were able to take this time to really dissect it and kind of look at the pros and cons and see, what might have been.
Absolutely. And I know I said this before, but it bears repeating it. One of the reasons why, I always love talking to you and now especially about Superman is, that you have a different perspective than I have. And, you've been reading the character so much longer. And, like I said, I'm going to be delving into the pre-crisis Superman as we move forward on this podcast. But, you have that frame of reference and you can help give me context and give your take on what it was like to be reading at the time. And it's so helpful to me. And as Rich was saying, we've been having these fantastic phone conversations about the George Reeves Adventures of Superman TV series. And very soon, we're going to have a couple of those that we record, and you'll hear them as upcoming episodes of Digging for Kryptonite. So I really can't wait till we record those, and I hope that everybody enjoys. So, Rich, thank you again. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Oh, listen, thank you. I loved this conversation. I hope your listeners I hope they enjoy it. I really do. So thank you. I'll ring off and enjoy it.
All right. Thank you, Rich. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Digging for Kryptonite. Be sure to tune in next time. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Greg Schiegel. Music by Basic Printer. If you like what you heard, be sure to listen to My Comic Shop History, available on most major podcast platforms. Sign up for exclusive additional content, including the Digging for Kryptonite companion podcast at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, and watch my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country, out now on Apple TV and Amazon.